I'm Rachel Tuckman. I'm a licensed mental health counselor working in the Five Towns. I am so grateful to Amudim for giving us this opportunity again to have a conversation about the things that we're passionate about mental health and about the topics that resonate with us. Getting together and talking with two of my favorite people, Rachel Herkman and Ellie Chevalis, and I'm going to let you guys introduce yourselves and then we will intro our topic for today.
I'm Rachel Herkman. I'm an LCSW, a licensed clinical social worker. I have an office on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and I also do trainings and speak in different communities. And I feel really passionate about having conversations about mental health and the way we relate to our struggles. I also have the honor of being the clinical director of the Lawyers Project magazine, which is an online magazine for Jewish women, where we enjoy being able to create conversations about the real things that are going on in people's lives and the communal healing that can come from us having more of those open conversations. So I'm so grateful to be here having an open conversation with both of you. And thank you to Amudim for being a trailblazer in really trying to push these types of programs forward. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Ellie Sheva.
Hi, thanks. I'm Ellie Chevalis. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, LMFT. I practice on Long Island and virtually. I also am a digital educator. I lecture to groups, but also online. And I write, I blog, I have articles and a book on healthy thinking. And like Rachel Herkman, I'm also, humbled and grateful to be included in these conversations, and especially organizations like Amudim that do so much to serve the greater community. And it's always so much fun to talk to my Rachel friends. So thank you.
So today we are talking about toxic positivity. And so I want to hear from you guys. I guess just when you hear toxic positivity, what is the definition that comes to your mind? And then let's just talk about, is it a problem? Is it something that is toxic positivity really a thing? Where does this come from? Some of the challenges, and then I guess finding the balance. What is the balance? If being so positive is really toxic, like what are we supposed to do? So I guess we'll start with Rachel. Tell me, when you hear toxic positivity, like what comes to mind?
I think the word toxic implies something that maybe is healthier in lower doses or a lower amount, but when it reaches a certain amount, it is no longer helpful and can have a detrimental effect. So when we talk about toxic positivity, what comes up for me is what I see happening for many people in situations. And I think this, obviously, it predates social media, which is that when somebody is going through something difficult and they're in a place of pain and they get a message, whether it's implicit, explicit, or they were educated in a culture where basically there was a sense of you just need to be positive all the time, and it's not okay to express feelings that don't sound positive and inspiring and uplifting. And when that is the only way that people feel is an acceptable way to share when they are going through something, I believe that it gets to a point where people can't hear the messages that others are trying to tell them, which they think is coming from, they're trying to help them, and it's very often it's coming from a good place. But because people feel like it's at a point now where people throw platitudes around, and it's kind of like, that's not necessarily the space the person was in that moment, that's where I think it gets to this place where we might call it toxic positivity, where it's positivity being thrown at people or shoved down their throats, right? You can offer someone the most beautiful piece of Napoleon, and if they say no thank you, but you shove it down their throat, they're not going to be able to fully enjoy it because they weren't in the space where they actually wanted to eat that, right? So I think this idea of giving people space, understanding what they are hungering for or yearning for in that moment, I think the toxic positivity piece is this kind of like very, it can sometimes lack a certain capacity to read the room and be able to take a step back and sense where a person is at. Right.
Elisheva.
It would be hard to add anything to that. That was so eloquent and comprehensive. I think you said what all three of us really, I can't speak for Rachel. I agree with everything you said. I would just add, my own thought is that something that I had been thinking about and actually had written about a few years before, but the language that I used was healthy and unhealthy positivity. Saying that, positivity is not always appropriate for every situation, whether internally or interpersonally. But it is useful to think in terms of healthy, sort of thinking like, when is it healthier to be positive and when is it healthier to explore, other orientations and emotions. And I had a conversation with a friend who's in more of the like spiritual motivational space, but she has definitely gone through her own life challenges and mental health challenges. And her approach for her own self and in her own style is more of a radical gratitude approach, very positivity oriented. And she was saying that she doesn't believe that there's such a thing as toxic positivity. She said like positivity can always be beneficial. It just depends like, who and when and how. And I think we ended up coming to an agreement that it was more about semantics. It was interesting because I found that the first time I heard the word toxic, I was concerned because I think there are certain strong words that get overused, especially in the social media space and especially in what is a very polarized kind of culture that we're living in right now, where people like jump to very dramatic language. And I was concerned, while I do, in my opinion, there is such a thing as toxic positivity, especially at the interpersonal level, trying to put a silver lining on somebody else's cloud. But I wondered whether maybe toxic was a stronger word than I was personally comfortable with. And then as I was hashing it out with his friends, something that I explained to her was that even in the intrapersonal, like meaning within a person's own self, right? If I try to skip steps, like if I try to jump ahead and just make it all good, like but it's okay. Like it's all going to be okay in the end, right? And I don't let myself first process the emotional and the psycho-spiritual like struggles that I'm having. Very often what will happen to people is they somaticize, right? They start to get like physical pain or ailments, and people actually can get sick from stress. We know this now. And so actually the word toxic in that case wouldn't be hyperbole. Like it would be appropriate to say that, sometimes when we suppress, when we repress, when we don't deal with things, it kind of manifests in other places for us, in our relationships or in our bodies. And so, so to me, actually, I kind of, in debating this issue, I actually sort of found like there is, I think, an appropriate place to use. And again, language is very personal. So if someone doesn't like the word toxic or doesn't like, picking on positivity, I remember once I had a client who told me, very cheerful, sweet, upbeat person, a lot of anxiety. And I had comments on them like, oh, you sure smile a lot. She's like, oh, I grew up in a pathologically positive home. It was so cute. So pathological positivity. And she gave me permission to recycle that phrase.
Right.
And positivity can be a coping skill, and coping skills aren't always bad, but, when we recognize them for what they are and sort of like acknowledge that, positivity is great, but like almost everything else, there's context, and, almost nothing is for every situation and every relationship, every moment.
Yeah. So I actually came across the term toxic positivity a bunch of years ago from a therapist that I follow on Instagram. Her name is Whitney Goodman. She's an LMFT, Sit with Whit. She's Gottman trained. She's fantastic. And she did this post that like went viral. It was all over the place about like helpful phrases when someone's going through something. And we'll talk about this later, because the research that we conducted together was like so fascinating. But she talked about toxic positivity, and I was like, wow, I had never heard that term either. But it happens to be that I have an aversion now to that word toxic also. And I actually saw another way to frame it would be dismissive positivity, which I think is actually a lot more accurate, right? Because if someone is going through something or we're going through something, and right away we look to put a positive spin on it, and we push away all other emotion, right? Not just we're trying to like focus on the positive or be optimistic, but we don't want to feel any of the negative. We are dismissing all other feelings. So I think that dismissive positivity made a lot more sense, right? That there's no room for any negative feelings, and we have to avoid those. And what that does is kind of like what you just said, is it just delays the inevitable. Like if you shove those feelings down and pretend they don't exist, it will come back in some way, either in your physical health, like in your body, you'll be feeling it, or emotionally, like you're just waiting to erupt. So I think that the whole idea of like toxic positivity is just, again, it doesn't acknowledge or make room for fear or pain or sadness or anger. And some of the things that I've seen are like, the one that drives me the craziest is really like, happy girls are the prettiest, right? Like oh, so if you're not happy, you're like ugly and disgusting, and we're always just supposed to smile, right? Or like good vibes only. Like, of course, we all want like good vibes in our life, but like the reality is like it can't always be good vibes. And like, what do we do when it's not? And so I think it is important for us to address kind of finding the balance between like what's optimism versus toxic positivity. Let's talk about the emotional, spiritual, intellectual components here. Let's talk about the difference between using positivity with yourself versus using it with someone else, right? Because there's a huge difference. Like telling yourself like God has a plan and there's a reason for this, that could be so helpful, but to someone else it could be like really, really hurtful and not helpful. And so I think that, you know, again, there is a place for positivity, and I don't want to leave anybody, you know, with the idea that we should never be positive or hopeful, but we do need to know, you know, that a lot of the time I think positivity is usually more helpful for us than for other people. And we shouldn't make assumptions about what people need or want to hear in moments of sadness. So something that we kind of touched on in our discussion before this was we were talking about the difference between using positivity with yourself versus someone else. And I guess now would be a good time for us to get into like our unofficial research that we conduct.
Yeah, let's, because I think that that really would open up a lot of the different places we would go with this.
Yeah.
Can I interject something before we go there? I just wanted to comment on something that Rachel Tuckman just said. You were saying how there's a very big difference between preaching to someone else, you know, like the perspective, God has a plan kind of messaging versus giving ourselves that messaging. And I completely agree with that. But I also want to say that even within the self, there's not always a consistent level of propriety. So I think like even within ourselves, there are times that we can sort of be more motivational in terms of telling ourselves like what we want to believe and using our belief and faith and strength to bolster ourselves in times of challenge. But also even within the self, saying like that's not always, sometimes even that can be dismissive, that even like within the self, that there are going to be times where that might not be what I need to hear even in my own head. And that's okay too. It doesn't, we'll get into that more, but it doesn't mean that you're a person of lower faith if you have to go through that process. In fact, faith gets refined and strengthened by being, you know, sort of challenged in times where the emotions challenge them. But anyway, we'll get into that more, but I just wanted, because you mentioned it.
That is very important. And I do want to talk about that because I do feel like people believe that it's like a lack of faith or a lack of amuna to like not be positive in hard times. But I think that's even like the problem with dismissive positivity, toxic positivity, is that it uses all or nothing language. So like everything happens for a reason. It's all for the best. Sometimes maybe, but then how do we believe that if like, you know, a young child dies, or God forbid in cases of like horrible abuse, like how can we say everything happens for a reason? Like we cannot use that line of thinking there. So I think that all or nothing language can be really unhelpful and detrimental. And it also kind of like makes us think that emotions are like nice and clean and simple and like, you know, happiness is a choice. Like, yeah, but sometimes it's not the healthy choice, right? And sometimes if you have depression, it's literally not a choice, right? So it stigmatizes a whole group of people and creates a lot of shame and judgment and misunderstanding, right? So if you have a family member who's struggling with depression, happiness is a choice. Why can't you just get out of bed? Why can't you just take your medication? Why, right? It creates this whole level of like misunderstanding or lack of compassion or lack of empathy because we think it's so simple, you know, just don't be angry, just stop crying. Like, but that's not how humans work. You know, we need a lot more space. We need a lot more empathy. Sometimes the only way out is through, you know, we can't avoid, like you were saying, we can't avoid those feelings. We asked on our platforms, our social media platforms, we kind of polled our audiences and said, like, when you were going through a struggle, what was something that you were told that was helpful, hurtful, and something that gave you hope? And what we ended up finding was that there was literally the same answer for each column, right? What was helpful for some was hurtful for others. What was hopeful?
Right, God has a plan was in all three categories.
And all three of us polled our own audiences,
yes,
and all three of us got repeat answers in all the columns. It was fascinating, right? Like
it was so interesting that literally people would say, like, you will get through this, I know it. That was hurtful for someone. Like, how do you know I'm going to get through this, you know? And then it was helpful for people to hear, like, I'm going to get through this. Like, thank you for that vote of confidence, you know? I'm just looking through some of them now. Like, you're going to be fine. You're going to be okay. That was hurtful to hear. You're going to be fine. You're going to be okay. what can I do to help? Someone actually said that that was not helpful because they were like, just tell me how you're going to help me. Like, don't ask me. I'm overwhelmed with that. I don't want to hear what can I do to help.
I've heard both of those. Meaning there's people like to quote that one of like, don't just say, tell me what I can do to help, because I'm confused and overwhelmed. Tell me what you're going to do to help. And then I've heard people say the other things like, well, now I have 12 lasagnas in my fridge because everybody told me they were going to give me a lasagna. Like, so you can really play that both ways. One thing that I think did come across from the answers, I didn't mean to cut you off, I'll keep going, but is that I think the energy behind people's messaging more than the words was when the empathy comes through. So whether, and a couple of people mentioned this, is that when you feel like the person is like, I'm here with you, right? Like I'm present with you. And even if I don't know exactly what to say or do, I want you to know that I'm here to support you and I'm feeling pain with you. Then I think the language that they use is almost secondary to the sentiment that presence conveys. Like another one was like, people said like, I wish people would just call me and not send a text. And I've heard other people, it wasn't in this, but I've heard other people say like, why are they calling me? Just send a text. Like, sorry, Rachel, continue.
No, it's true.
Right.
And I think that's really what it is. I think the theme was that people wanted to just feel cared about,
Mhm.
And I think that it's a lot of the time, I think it's important for us to realize that, like, we were saying earlier, what's helpful for me when I'm sad might not be helpful for you. And I think that the question of like, what can I do to be helpful? I want to be helpful is a great question. But yeah, then there's like, well, I don't know what I need and I don't know what will be helpful for me. And that's where I kind of say, okay, then we kind of have to just try to kind of figure it out. But definitely, I think that when we use things like, God has a plan and he was so good and that's why he was taken and only you can handle this and this will make you a stronger person and one day you'll be able to tell your story and strengthen people. I think we have good intentions. And again, sometimes those things were helpful in our poll. I saw that people sometimes did like hearing that. But we also have to ask ourselves, like, am I telling someone this because I am so uncomfortable with their discomfort right now and their unhappiness or their anger or their sadness that I'm trying to like make them feel, no, it's not so bad. Like there's a light at the end of the tunnel. Maybe they're not ready for the light yet. Maybe they need to sit in the darkness a little bit. And it reminds me of that famous Brene Brown video, right? Where she says like, sometimes it's getting down into that hole with them and sitting with them. It's not pulling them out of that deep, dark, hole that they're in. It's getting down and sitting with them and saying, hey, I'm here, and whenever you're ready, I'm going to come out with you.
Can I share a few points on that?
Yeah.
One of the things that I thought was interesting, first of all, was how quick people were to send us their input and their experiences, which I think that in and of itself was very telling in terms of that, like, this is something that is very universal, that life struggle is very universal, and that people, I think, do appreciate an opportunity to share what an experience meant for them and what they may have needed differently in that experience. But not everyone's willing to ask that question, right? Not everyone's willing to say, what do you think you needed in that moment? So I was taking some notes on some patterns that I saw, because I like to like classify things sometimes. And what I noticed was this: some of these lines touch on one's relationship to God, okay? Some of these things touch on your relationship to pain, okay? Just pain in general, feeling pain, right? Some of these things related to your relationship to time, right? So when people are saying things like, oh, like time heals all wounds, which like we saw that in all three categories. Yeah. Like people saying like, oh, with time it's going to get better. And there are people who are like, don't tell me that, like, you don't know that for sure. Yeah. Right. So, and I think another piece that came up was that, and Alicia, you touched on this, is that if the content is all about relationship to time or to God or to pain, but there isn't really an appreciation for actually the relationship between these two people who are speaking. In other words, to take that into account of, well, who am I to this person anyway? Because I do find that sometimes when these things happen, people take it upon themselves in a well-meaning way to share things. And the other thing about that as well is that we're at a place now where we are making so much more room for people to share their personal experiences. And personal experience is not the same as expertise. And certainly personal experience does not make someone the expertise on how everyone else is going to do things. And I think there's something hurtful for people, or they don't feel seen when somebody is making their own healing situation the blueprint for your healing situation, and you're like, but this isn't about you. Like, that may not relate to me. That may not be my story. And I also, like Alicia said, I also had this as well, that there were a few people who said something to me about, it wasn't about what was said, it was about the space
Yeah.
that
And
they
the
were in.
relationship. Yeah, the context and the relationship.
It was in the relationship. And the other thing I noticed also was in the parts where people said things were helpful or hopeful, the pattern I saw was there was permission for feelings, permission for experiences, permission for how can I be most helpful to you. There was more of a permission. There was more of a sense of presence of like, I'm here with you. I love you. I'm here with you. I have your back. You're not alone. And then the last piece was also a P, was the sense of possibility versus certainty.
Yeah.
I think that is something that is where it's very hard for us to sit with that uncertainty. I think they call it maybe land, right? It's hard to be in the maybe land when we're going through struggles, and that people can sometimes feel like it's being put upon them in the sense of certainty of I know exactly how it's going to go. And then it's not helpful for them because they feel like, are you trying to console me or just control a narrative here? So those were some of my, thank you. So those were some of my 1 a.m. observations, and I'm grateful that they still make sense in the morning, because, 1 a.m. things, you're not always like, I think this makes sense.
Yeah, I also noticed on, because some of the people who responded, most of them are people that I didn't know, but there were a handful of people that I did know. And just from those that were, I think, again, because of the way we did this research, it was more ad hoc and more generalized. But I think it also, we can't always lump challenges together in one category. So there's a difference between someone who's going through a challenge where like that maybe land where we don't know what's going to happen next, versus someone in the aftermath of a tragedy, where there's a mourning process. So let's say somebody wrote like, I hate when people this is someone who lost a loved one at a young age, said like, I don't want people to tell me it's going to get better. What's it? And how do they know it's going to get better? And maybe I don't want it to get better. Maybe I'm scared it's going to get better, whereas like, I remember, just to share a personal example, many years ago, my husband was very sick. Thank God he's well now. But there were people who were coming to us and saying, oh, I had that type of cancer and look at me, I'm all better now. And it was so interesting because his like feeling about that at the time was like, don't put that kind of pressure on me. Like, I don't know if I'm going to make it, leave me alone. Like, don't, it's like, if you can do it, if I could do it, you can too, And for me, it was very encouraging to see people who had been, very, very ill, and now we're in such good health. And I don't think it's because he was the patient and I was the spouse. It could be, but I think it just has to do more with like the way different personalities process other people's input. And that's, I think, a good personal example of the distinction that you were making just now, Rachel, between experience and expertise. And so even something like that fell within all three categories of, someone coming along and saying, this something similar happened to me as well. And maybe my story can give you some encouragement or make you feel less alone. Some people found that incredibly like heartening and empathetic, and other people found it like threatening, or don't make this about you. It's not your time to shine, or, and so it's kind of like what you said before, read the room. Something that I sometimes will advise, like when people say like, okay, what am I supposed to do? I'm trying to reach out to a friend and I don't want to say the wrong thing, because I think the challenge is, and this is whether we're talking about tragedies, whether we're talking about stressors where we don't know the outcome, or even just more minor things, like people just struggling with something that wouldn't be considered by most people to be like a big life crisis, but they're struggling anyway, is that there are so many wrong things to say and so much fewer right things to say. And so, a lot of people sort of avoid, and avoidance was one of the things that was listed as something that people were hurt by. Like, hey, my sister didn't even reach out and she knew I was going through a hard time. It's like, well, there's a chance that your sister didn't reach out because she was so scared of saying the wrong thing, or maybe thought you needed your space. So something that I feel like you can't really go too wrong with in most scenarios is to reach out. And my bias is to do it not with a phone call, but in writing, saying, just like text or message, sort of saying like, hey, I'm thinking of you. I don't really know, sometimes it's not clear I wish I knew the right thing to say or to do or to offer. But I just wanted you to know that I'm here, thinking of you, available if you want to talk, or if there's something I can do, or if you want to just get together and talk about something totally different, just kind of like letting them, like kind of calling out the reality for what it is, of that, like, you're a person that's important to me, and I know that you're in pain, and I feel that for you. And so not pretending or guessing to know exactly what the right thing to say is, but that sometimes I find that just saying, I don't even know, or I wish I knew the right thing to say or do it, but I don't, but I also want to show up for you. I think people appreciate that, because it's kind of a blank page on which to offer like generic, not generic in a bad way, but sort of like gentle support. And it also kind of like offers the person to let you know, like, is there something that, because sometimes like when I've asked, let's say, clients who are going to be very open with me, like, how should your sister, your best friend, your neighbor, your mother-in-law, how should she have come through for you? Like, what would have been the better response? And very often they'll pause and they'll be like, you know what, I don't even know. Like, I don't even know what I really needed. I just know that what they did or didn't do wasn't right. But sometimes what they'll do is they'll look in the mirror and say, maybe there was nothing right to do in that moment. Maybe anyone doing anything or saying anything or avoiding, I was just in too much pain to receive any kind of support. And just having that acknowledgement that people do care about you at a tough time, even if there's nothing concrete or verbal that can make it better, is still better than nothing.
Yeah. I think that I don't remember which one of you guys said it when we were talking, but I think it might have been you, Rachel. But claim the credit, whoever said it. But one of you said one person's chizuk, one person's strength and encouragement, it can be another person's dagger in the heart.
It was
Elisheva.
I say that, yeah.
But that was like, for when you said that, I was like, whoa, that was like so poignant for me. I'm like, yes, that encompasses like our conversation so perfectly. Like something that could be so encouraging for one could be so hurtful for another. And I think that's why, this conversation is important. I think we need to think about what are the norms in our community. Something that I heard on a David Bashevkin podcast with Josh Griejower, which was a really great podcast that I recommend people listen to. He was talking about his loss, and he was saying that like in our community, like we don't have the language to handle sadness. We're afraid of negative emotion. And he found that people like didn't know how to approach him. Like it was awkward for them and uncomfortable, and everybody had good intentions. And we were saying here, people intentions did matter, but for him, he was saying, it wasn't even good enough. The intentions didn't help because people were like fumbling, and it ended up being hurtful to him. And so I think that there needs to be a conversation about that. Like we are, as a culture, not even our religion alone, as a culture, we are like happiness obsessed, and I saw a great quote from Esther Perel where she was saying that like happiness has become like this burden for us, that we're all like constantly chasing it, and it's like this outcome and a mandate even. And she was saying like we have to understand that happiness is like a moment, and that we are complex human beings with a wide range of emotions, and there's a place for all of it. There's a place for sadness, there's a place for jealousy, there's a place for anger. All of these things serve functions, and like we have to stop chasing happiness. Because something that she said also was like, she's like, we're so caught up in like asking, like, am I happy? Wait, was that happiness? Am I feeling happy? That like we don't even get to be, right? That we don't even
taking our happiness pulse all the time.
all the time.
Right. We're not even here. We're not even present. One of the ways that when someone's in pain and someone else says something to them and it's like a total airball is where it's basically the person is not dealing with an intellectual wound. So we don't need an intellectual Band-Aid. We don't need an intellect. And that's where I think some of these statements that we saw in our unofficial data is that some of these statements, I think if someone's in a certain headspace or heart space, they might be open to hearing something like that. And that might be helpful. I think about my own challenges I've been through. There have been things that people have said to me that really were so awesome in that moment. But I know that if I heard that at a different point in that situation, it would have been very, and I was going to say hurtful, but what makes it hurtful is that you want to say to the person, hello, like that's not the place that we're at right now in this conversation. Or, are you consoling or are you controlling this narrative, right? Can you give permission for an experience? And I think something else that came up while you were speaking is that I find that very often when we pivot to fault finding, when I slow it down with people clinically or even just an informal conversation, we really slow down fault finding. There's often underneath it, there's this reservoir of powerlessness. And that's why, just to give an example, let's say we're talking about infertility, but this can happen for other situations too. where there's so much of the fault finding of like, whose fault is it? Like I found like after May Roan, there was like an immediate like obsession with fault finding. And yes, there were clearly things that needed to be explored. And I really hope that that continues in terms of addressing that. But I do think that it's sometimes easier to be in a blame place, even blaming ourselves. Sometimes it's easier to be, I call it preferred pain. Sometimes our preferred pain is to sit and blame ourselves about something than to sit with a certain really difficult powerlessness over life and over a situation that may have happened to us. And that, when I find, that's what's happening often in these social conversations where there's this misplaced positivity or this in-your-face positivity. It's, are we able to just sit and be still, to be with a powerlessness of, you know what, there really is nothing to say right now. There is nothing to say right now. There is no, you know, I like to say, like, you know, resilience, you know, you can't tie everything with a bow. And there's this pressure that we have to tie everything with a bow during the process, after the process, and being able to sit with it that no, not everything always is going to come together in this really beautiful way. And it's all going to make sense. And it's all going to feel worth it. You know, resilience, which, by the way, if we want to do another interesting kind of social media questioning thing, is what is, how do you define resilience? Because I think the word resilience has, I think everyone has a different perception of it. I think resilience for one person can mean you just get up in the morning and you literally get up in the morning and you put one foot in front of the other, and that's resilient. There are people that resilience means that they then become this like motivational person where they, like, everywhere they go, they're giving people encouragement. So I think understanding that like resilience doesn't mean you sound like a motivational calendar, and that people sometimes think of themselves as that they are not strong enough because they don't look like that other person over there who is supposedly so strong and resilient, which also ties into that thing that, and some people wrote this also, that they don't like being told, oh, you're so strong. Because it's kind of like the analogy that comes up for me is, let's say like your car broke down and you're on the side of the road and you're changing your own tire, and someone's like, oh my gosh, you're like so good at changing tires. Wow. Like, I don't think you'd be flattered and be like, oh my God, thank you so much. Like, I feel so good that like you're saying I'm talented at changing tires. Because you'd be like, I don't want to be here right now. I don't want to be changing this tire. I want to be on the road with everyone else right now.
Right.
So said a lot there, but again, that sense of like, can we be with the person in this moment right now? Can we be with ourselves in this moment right now and be able to ask these questions of like, what is this really about? What are we running away from?
Right.
What is it that's holding us back from just being able to slow that down and be able to read the room better?
Right. Yeah.
Again, it's not liking those uncomfortable feelings. Sorry, Richard.
No, yeah. I mean, it's boiling down to like, we are always trying to fix, and we're so uncomfortable with brokenness, right? And like, we don't like the idea that some things just can't be fixed and we have to just let things be. And I think sometimes people confuse comfort with like advice or encouragement. Sometimes comfort is just like, this sucks. Like, oh, this is, I just feel so sad and I wish this wasn't happening to you. And, you know, like, this isn't fair. Like, sometimes it's just acknowledging, and people are like, no, that's going to make them feel worse. But maybe it's just even saying nothing, just sitting there, you know, and letting it just be. But I think that we feel very afraid of brokenness. We feel very afraid of things that can't be fixed. We feel very afraid of uncertainty, which makes sense. You know, nobody likes that. We don't like to feel like we're hanging and we don't know what's going to be. And I think also, I know for me personally, like when I've grappled with like a discomfort with someone's sadness, it's because like we start feeling the fear of like, oh my God, like I remember that I'm vulnerable too, to be in this, you know? And I think a lot of time we're trying to comfort ourselves, like, you're going to be okay. Like, I'm here for you. Yeah, I'm going to do, you're not alone in this, but we're like trying to wrap it up. But really we're trying to even comfort ourselves, because I realize, you know what, God forbid I could suffer the same fate as you. And like, I don't even want to sit with that reality. So I'm trying to like package it up nice and make it like, oh, you're so strong. And like, we're going to get through this. And, you know, and maybe that is the truth. They are going to get through this and they are going to find their strength. But that's not what they need right now in that moment. But I think sometimes it's because we face our own fears, our own mortality, our own whatever it is, and we try to push it away, you know?
Yeah, I think people even sometimes feel like pain is contagious. You know what I mean? Like they're trying to protect themselves from it. there's a fear of being silent because like, silence is the worst thing ever, right? Like it's too awkward, right? Like, and being able to just sit with the quiet and saying like, this is hard and I'm here. And that's all I know how to do right now because I can't wrap it up with a bow and I can't fix it. And I think there's also, like you said, you get reminded of our own fragility, our own susceptibility right there, but for the grace of God and luck, we all, we are what we are. And it could have just as easily been us. And that's a scary feeling for people. But I think that people really are afraid that it's like, if I get too close to it, if I feel the empathy too much, I'm going to catch that energy. And I think even just knowing that that's something that people are sometimes uncomfortable from allows us to peel that back and say, wait, no, they're them and I'm me. And that's why boundaries are so important, because if I know that you're you and I'm me, then I can be there for you without becoming you, right? Without being absorbed by you.
It's such a good point, because what you're saying is what I heard in what you were saying is the sense of dysregulation that happens for us when we hear news or we know about situations that make us feel that fragility of life. And that on a practical level, because we like to give people some practical, examples or applications, is that sometimes people want to reach out to the person to get updates. And the person who's going through the situation is dealing with a million things and may not have the energy to start updating. And by the way, if you're someone who hasn't been close with the person up until that point, and now suddenly you're, texting them all the time, that I think can make people feel uncomfortable too. Because it's like, we weren't so close and now all of a sudden you want to be my best friend. Like, I'm not a celebrity because I'm going through something. Like, but, and not everyone necessarily deserves to get an update. Like, not everyone has to get an update, but something for people to ask themselves is, am I asking these questions? Am I asking this question because I care, or because I'm curious for myself and I'm dysregulated and I want to hear that, oh, there was a car accident and they weren't wearing seatbelts, so I could feel relieved and say, okay, I wear seatbelts. I will make sure to wear seatbelts, and therefore I will be safe, right? That dysregulation that you're referring to, and that fragility of life, Rachel, that whole idea that can drive some of the comments and questions that people can ask, that for the person hearing it, it just feels so like, oh my God, how could you ask that? How could you say that? Listen to yourself. But that's the thing. They're totally in their own head, trying to regulate themselves so that they can continue on their day.
Yeah. I think people want to know, like, I think that there's this fear that like not all pain is redeemed. And it's like some things we just learn to live with, and the pain doesn't go away. And I love that, like, I'm sure so many of you have seen that, but that visual of the grief ball in the jar, right? 3 different jars, the ball never shrinks in size. The ball stays the same, but the jar gets bigger. So your grief will always be with you, and it doesn't necessarily get better, but you learn to like build life around it. And I think if we like just learn to get comfortable with that, or not even comfortable, we learn to be uncomfortable with that, then I think that's something that can be very empowering for us, and it could make these negative emotions less scary. But yeah, sometimes pain doesn't go away, and that's just a part of life.
There's another piece that I wanted that Rachel Herkman, what you were just saying reminded me of. I wonder if you guys experience this. I know that for myself, sometimes when I go to a funeral or a Shiva house, one of the fears that I have is that I'm going to feel something bigger than it's my appropriate right to feel. So let's say like if I'm at a funeral and I feel myself welling up with tears before like the people closer in that circle are crying, I feel like, no, I don't, that's inappropriate. Like I don't want to be crying before they're crying, or, feeling more emotional than the people who, or expressing more emotion than the people who are more entitled to feel that emotion. And then that sort of very self-conscious feeling of like, I don't want to do the wrong thing. I don't want to make it worse. I don't want to, attract attention. And I think that's another piece that people struggle with. Like, I know I've heard people say this actually, that like, I feel like I don't have the right to be this sad. I didn't even know them so well. And again, I don't know that there's a specific solution to this, but even just sort of like, the concept of if you can name it, you can tame it, just kind of saying these are the different messy, complex reactions and feelings and emotions that we have around other people's pain and stress. Like, I think it's a universal thing when we hear that someone's sick, it's like, well, what do they have? When you hear someone died, it's like, oh, what did they die from? It's like, what, like, we're going to do anything about it at this point? Like there's, but it's just a kind of a universal human curiosity, and it's not always just coming from a place of empathy. I think that's part of it, but also this place of like the dysregulation that it brings to ourselves. And again, just being aware of that and knowing that like the goal is the empathy, feeling the empathy and expressing the empathy and sharing whatever we're going to share and reaching out in that way with empathy. I think that that would be like sort of the grounding principle of how we want to show up. And there's something else that I was thinking about hearing both of you speak, which is that I think until now we focused a lot on what we as the supporting party can do, right? Like when I'm the supporting party. But I think also for, in most people at some point in their lives are going to bump up against something where other people are going to have to take care of us. And also to remember that when people show up, they're going to do so imperfectly. They're going to do so imperfectly from their own space. And also just based on like, in that moment, there might actually be nothing that I would be able to receive well, not because that person is insincere or selfish or inappropriate, but just because there is like, vayima'im lehinachem, like there's just nothing that can comfort me, which was said about Yaakov Avinu, a really great person, right? Like everyone tried to make him feel comforted, but there was no comfort to be found. And because I have heard of people who would say this, like at first I was just like not okay to hear anything from anyone and people fell away and then I felt isolated. So to remember that when people show up in imperfect ways, either if they're people that do really care for you and want to show up in the right way, maybe to redirect them and say, thanks for trying, that didn't help, but you can give me a hug, or you can make me coffee, or if it's someone who you think will be receptive to that. And if not, to remind yourself like the difference between like the action and the intention, to say like, they're trying, they meant well. It's the kind of thing that maybe in another mood or in another circumstance I would appreciate hearing. It was tone deaf for me right now. But again, it doesn't have to be that sort of black and white dismissive, like it's all bad, it's all good. It's just people are trying, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I would add on to that, if I may, that I think this is so relevant, especially now during the pandemic, of just, we've been dysregulated for a very long time, a very, very long time. And that relationships change. Our relationship to ourselves changes, and relationships with other people change, and friendships change through struggle also. And that can add, I think, to the grief sometimes when people go through painful times, and they learn more about the people around them and what they are capable of in terms of showing up, or just the space they have. And yeah, making space for the fact that people aren't perfect. But I also think that because these experiences can change us as people, that it is okay for us to feel sad if we notice that it changes other relationships as well. And very often, and we saw this in research of people talking about this thing of getting to the other side of things. People often say like, oh, you're going to get to the other side of it. And it has this very linear before and after, almost like you're driving, you're going to go through this dark tunnel, and then you're just going to like keep driving and you're going to get back to yourself, right? And what I think maybe it would help for us to make more space for as a community is that it's not just that we drive through that dark tunnel and keep driving, but really to give permission for people to honor the fact that we might drive through that dark tunnel and lose a part of ourselves, maybe gain a new part of ourselves, or get to know a new part of ourselves, but we might lose parts of ourselves that we're not going to get back, and we're not going to get back to ourselves in this, like, you are exactly the same way you were before this thing happened to you. And I think when we lower the bar of kind of what it's supposed to look like when you've been through something and now you're not on the other side of it, it just takes up a different amount of space. Like I often say, like something can happen to me or something becomes me, right? When we're in that thing we're going through, it doesn't just happen to you, it like becomes you. And then hopefully with some healing and with time, which time may not change that, but for some people, for some experiences, they can start to feel like this thing, I don't feel all the time like that became me, so to speak, that I'm still that all the time. And really honoring that in terms of that everyone is so different in how they relate to their experiences. And we're not abnormal if we have, and it's okay to not be okay. It's also okay to be okay. That's something else I think it's helpful to throw out here.
I think that I like all of your points, but I even like the idea, and I actually heard this recently about like using this language of like, instead of I'm stressed, I'm sad, I notice I'm feeling sad, I notice I'm feeling stressed. And there was actually like, they had done like brain imaging where people were saying I'm stressed versus I'm feeling stressed, and the impact that it had on the body. And so it really does matter. Like, and clearly it was showing that when you said I'm stressed, there was like more reactivity in your body in terms of stress hormones versus I feel stressed, right? So noticing like that you are not your feeling or emotion, but that you are experiencing it. So I thought that that was such a great point. And I think that like a good point for us to kind of wrap up with would be talking about like what's healthy optimism versus toxic positivity. Like, what does it look like when we're just developing more inner resources and coping tools? And what is it when we're being dismissive, when we're shoving things down? You know, like, is there this balance? And the answer is yes, but let's talk about it a little bit of healthy positivity and optimism and gratitude. There is space for that. And then where is there, you know, when is that maybe not the appropriate response?
So the way I like to look at it is I like the metaphor of the horizon, right? If you picture, let's say, like where the sky meets the water or the ground, there's sort of a line, like a horizontal line. The word horizon is in there. And the way kind of I like to help clients and myself actually look at things is that there are three general categories that we can find ourselves in as far as responding. There's what I call below the horizon of healthy function, when we know we're in that like dysregulated place and we're feeling this like flood of unwanted, unpleasant emotion, either in response to something that we're thinking or feeling, or into a trigger, you know, a stimulus, something that went on with another person, a life event. And that's when we're sort of below. And the first thing to do there is to not rush out of it, but just to sort of say, whoa, okay, this feels like a lot. This is overwhelming. And again, there's a difference between I am versus this is. But even if you're feeling at the first place of like, I'm feeling like a mess, just give yourself permission to say, 1 second, I'm allowed to feel like a mess for, you know, for a moment or so, right? Like we don't always have to be so strong, right? First, acknowledge what is and not try to clean it up right away. Let it be, sit with it, feel it. It's okay, right? Then we want to pull it up onto what I call like the horizon of healthy function, just like to take a step back and detach from it. So if I were telling somebody about this scenario, let's say I didn't know the person so well, and I was just taking more of a dispassionate, more of a clinical approach of this is what's going on right now, right? This is what we're struggling with right now. And just kind of describe it in a more even-keeled narrative way. So that way you create a little space, a little bit of distance. Okay, then the next question, so it's a process, right? We're below that horizon of healthy function, right? There's like a lot going on. We're feeling all the feelings that we don't necessarily want to sit with for a long term. Then there's sort of like acknowledging, narrating what's going on, just it is what it is. The analogy that I use is kind of like a sailboat, just like kind of tracing the horizon, just bobbing along on the waves. And then the sort of the next step, which isn't always appropriate, but it's, you know, always a possibility, is to say, what would be not a positive, but a healthier way for me to engage with this reality, this stressor, this thought, this feeling, this relationship? Like, it's not ideal. It's not what I would have ordered. It's not what I would have asked for. But once I'm here, right, that space between stimulus and response, what, if anything, can I do from a place of realistic empowerment to say, can I make this a little bit better for myself? And that could have to do with something internal, right? Like generating a different way of thinking about it, something external, taking some sort of action. I always say like kind of it branches up between action and acceptance. Sometimes there's something I can do to make things a little bit better. Sometimes there's nothing I can do externally. So it has to do with kind of like taking some deep breaths and reassessing the language that I use even within myself to just sort of say, okay, but this is what it is right now. And maybe I can start to make some peace with that. So, you know, and to me, that feels very different than the Pollyanna-ish of like, you know, I had somebody who once told me that like she had a mentor that she used to call for like advice and encouragement, but she stopped reaching out to her because this mentor eventually at some point in the conversation would be like, but it's all good, right? Like, it's all good. Like, like, everything God does is for the best. And she was just like, I know that I believe that spiritually and theologically, but that's not like where I am right now. Like, I need like a hug over the phone. Like, I just like, that's, you know, whereas kind of like exploring, going through those stages of like, wow, this is really hard. This really hurts. This is not so easy. And saying all the bad words you need to say in order to like feel those feelings, then kind of getting up above, like lifting your head out of the water and saying, okay, but like I can get some air here and like what's actually going on, like in a more strategic way. And then finally pulling out to the next level and saying, is there anything that I can do differently? Is there anything that's within my locus of control that I can then take action or edit my thoughts to make this hurt less, to make this less damaging, either within myself or within my relationships? And sometimes you come up with something and sometimes not, but then that's the acceptance piece. Like, no, there isn't. So I just have to like, this is what this is, and, you know, and move on, you know, forward. That would be like kind of a short version answer of what I would say.
Yeah. Rachel, you have thoughts you want to share?
So many, so I'm going to try to sum it up. So a few pieces. So there was an answer that I got in a DM that I actually like, I was crying from it. It was just such a powerful story. This woman shared that when she was in seminary, she was very close with her teacher, and she confided in the teacher that she had relapsed regarding self-harm, that she had struggled with self-harm a couple of years before, and now in seminary she relapsed, and she told her teacher she was very close with, and her teacher responded and said, how many days had it been up until this relapse? And she said, it was like several hundred days, 500 days or something. And her teacher said, okay, well, we're going to go out to dinner, and I think we should celebrate that, because we have to celebrate that. And I have chills just thinking about it, because in the DM, it was basically saying, like, it pulled me out of a despair that I really could have gotten sucked into. And it was really just, it hit that spot of, we're not going to just sugarcoat this, and we're not just going to say Gamzela Tova, and we're going to recognize that something happened here, but we're not going to do it in a way where we're dismissing the whole picture, where we're dismissing your feelings. And I was so happy she sent me that message, because it's so beautiful. And I think there's a difference between burying our feelings and being with our feelings. And we all have various ways that we might bury feelings. Sometimes we have to bury feelings because we have a lot to do right now and we can't deal with something, so we bury it. And people have different ways of burying feelings. The issue I find is that when we're always burying our feelings, and the ways we might bury it can be by just saying everything has to be positive, and we're not going to even allow ourselves to be with the feeling. We could bury feelings through other behaviors that we might call self-destructive, but are often meant to be self-soothing. And if we're always burying feelings, number one, we don't develop tools to deal with and be with our feelings. We don't develop the confidence that we can be with our feelings. And we think that feelings are always very heavy. And one of the reasons why we think the feelings or emotions are so heavy is not necessarily because the emotions are so heavy, but it's because if we're always burying feelings, that means we're always walking around with a shovel.
Yeah.
And there's something exhausting about that, of always having to be on guard, making sure the second a feeling might come up, we're going to bury it. And that process can happen within ourselves of trying to bury our own feelings. And it can happen when people are trying to console someone else, that they're trying to bury the other person's feelings that to them sound negative or not hopeful. And the idea of can we be with our feelings? And if I would just wrap up with my last point, I think, and this we came across this in a lot of messages, the idea of that personal touch, that when someone is going through something and they feel alone, and they could be surrounded by other people, they could have 55 lasagnas in their freezer and still feel incredibly alone. I remember when I was going through something very difficult, and it wasn't a common diagnosis. I had this very rare lung tumor. And I remember saying, I feel really lucky and very lonely also, meaning I felt very grateful that I have, thank God, it was excellent prognosis and I recovered, but it was also a very lonely place to be diagnosed with something, and not something that a lot of people have. So the idea of the personal touch, and I think on a practical level, I think in between, let's say between sending someone a text message or calling, is sending a voice note. Because I think a voice note, at least you can hear what they're saying, and it's not just a copy and paste text message, right? When we hear someone's voice, I'm a big fan of handwriting. I know handwriting is an endangered species, but there's something so powerful when you see a handwritten card versus something typed. I'm not saying that everyone now needs to start mailing letters, although I think it's cool to mail letters, but whatever, that's just me. But even just something like that, of just the idea of showing a personal touch, and can make such a difference in how people feel in those moments, that it's not about what we say necessarily, it's about our ability to be still with them, but also to be aware that to be aware of the boundaries, even within that context, and to be able to sit with the humility of the powerlessness of these challenges that we go through, and to be able to be with that, and to be able to lean on each other, and also understand that these are things a lot of people deal with. So with that, I'll pass.
Love that. So, I mean, I guess to wrap it up, I would just add you guys expressed it so beautifully, but I guess I would just add, like, when we are trying not to bypass our feelings, you just want to make sure also that, like, we're not, we had mentioned in our talk separately, we didn't touch on this here, but like fixating and versus focusing, right? So you don't have to, and we had mentioned this earlier, even in this talk, like, if you're not feeling like you need to sit with your feelings right now, you don't have to. So you can decide, like, right now, I don't feel like I want to be in my pain. but maybe just being self-aware to ask like, but am I avoiding it right now? Or is this like an actually healthy coping mechanism right now? Because sometimes that is what we need to do to get through. We need to kind of like not process it, and we need to just keep moving. You can sit with your feelings, but don't obsess with them, and start living in those feelings. And, say like my therapist told me, like, it's okay not to be okay. So I'm not going to be okay. Like, but like you said, Rachel, it's okay to be okay too, and we shouldn't ignore problems, but we also shouldn't pretend that that's all that there is, and I think that there is that balance of optimism. And I think it's important to distinguish even like what are like some optimistic things you can say that are not toxic positivity. And I actually had written a post about this. I called it non-Pollyanna mantras that you can say to yourself, because mantras in general, I think, can be very helpful. And I think saying something like, this is really hard, but like, I'm going to get through it, or I know I'm going to be okay, or I know I have support, or, I know my friends care, things like that. Those can be optimistic without like taking away how you're feeling, or without denying the reality of your situation. And I think in some cases, yes, we do have choice how we want to feel. And I think that you should exercise that choice. Right now, I don't want to be miserable. I want to get up and take care of my kids because I have to. This is my choice right now, or I don't want to, but I'm going to make that choice to get up and do that. Or I don't want to show up at this thing, but I'm going to, because I know that ultimately, like, this is the path to healing. So it's not black and white. It's extremely nuanced. And I love that we did highlight how, we sometimes feel like our community does not have the language, but through all of the Tanakh, I feel like Rebbetzin Elisheva here just gave us all of this wonderful, like, it is so much a part of in terms of the Jewish community, there is that language. It does exist. And I remember, Elisheva, you had a post around Sukkot time about reading Kohelet, and about how this time of joy, we're reading this like really depressing, seems like super, negative, like, I hate my life.
Saniti et hachayim. I hate life. Literally, that's what it says.
Right. And that really stuck with me, how
it's like a teenager, like slamming their door, going to their room.
Yeah. Like, it's this time of happiness, but we're reading about this guy who's like really like struggling.
Brilliant. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that was like, again, it was such a reminder, like, and even in your caption, how you wrote it, but it was a reminder of like, there is a time, and we say that in Kohelet, there is a time for happiness, there's a time for sadness, there's a time for joy, there's a time for mourning. Like, we do have this language, and we do validate the range of human emotions. And we should do that within ourselves and with other people. And again, I think that something that stuck with me from the answers about what people said gave them hope was when they would hear stories from people who went through similar things, and not even about like their personal experience, but just when they would see those people show up and say like, look, I'm here, like, I went through it too, and I'm here. And I remember I had recently just gone to a Shiva house of someone who lost a spouse, and I went with a friend who had lost her spouse. And this person was saying like, seeing you here gives me so much comfort. You're smiling, and she's like, it just gives me comfort that you're smiling and you're laughing. Because right now I don't feel like I can, but like, I see that you're doing it. She hadn't even said a word. We were just sitting, and she was laughing at a story that the person who was mourning was sharing. And she's like, you're laughing and smiling. Like, I know one day I'm going to be able to.
Yeah, me too.
Her presence was so, like, she hadn't even.
And that's the key. She didn't say, look, I'm smiling, so you will too. She didn't have to preach it. It's the showing up that made it less is more in a certain sense. Like,
and I thought that was it was like, wow, she just came in the room,
Presence. It was a presence.
And I think the power of presence, I think that's kind of even what we have to emphasize. We don't have to fix, we don't have to put a bow, we don't have to tie it up, we don't have to promise everything's going to be okay, because we can't. Sometimes we have to, like I said, not all pain is redeemable. Sometimes we just have to like sit with that. So thank you guys so much for this. Thank you, Amudim, for creating this opportunity for us to just like chat and talk about these things. And we look forward to hearing feedback from you guys about your thoughts on this, and to good things in the future. Thank you.